Back again YouTube, and welcome back to the coding workshop. And in this series we're going to go ahead, as I said from last night, we want to push on from our session component and jump straight into some base classes. And you can see I've got my editor open. This is the current directory structure that we're working in. I've already pushed what we've done last night in terms of our session. That's been pushed to GitHub, so you can go on there, you can download the project code so far and carry on. But in this video we actually wanted to go over some base class that we're going to use for our MVC application. And when I come to actually implementing that MVC application in an application environment, I'm going to actually go through some diagrams and explain to you the data flow through our actual project. All the data is flowing from the dispatcher all the way through to the controller, to the entities, to the repository, and back through the controller into the view. So again, I'm going to explain all of that when we'll come to implement the application, because I think it will be easier at that point to do it. But at this point, all we're doing, we're just sort of like creating all the base classes, all the core functionality, so we can easily put these within our application and make our life a lot easier. So as I said, I want to create a couple of base classes, and I'm going to show you how we're going to do that. So I'm going to create 3 classes to start off with. So I'm going to start with my base controller class .php. Then I need base model .php and a base view .php. And these files are going to be the file that we're going to inherit from in our application, and it's going to provide us with some nice little helper function to help us quickly build out our application without rewriting code over and over again. So we're keeping it dry. We're using that dry principle as we mentioned at the very beginning. So start off with our controller, and these are going to be quite basic. We're going to build them out as we go along. So we're going to just keep it basic for now, just a starter file, so we know it's there, so we can add to it as we start building out our application. It'll be PHP declare, and we're going to be in the base directory. All right, say class base controller, and this class takes a couple of properties, but as I said, I'm going to go through them individually as we go along, so you know exactly what they're doing. And the first one I'm going to create is a protected array, and that's going to be our route params, and I'm not going to initialize it. And we're going to create a constructor for this base controller class. Say public function construct, and within this constructor I'm going to actually require one argument, and this one argument is what we can use to get our route parameters in all of our subcontroller classes. So I'm going to say array route params, then just going to pipe this property to this constructor argument. Now you're probably wondering where we're getting these params from, and I'm going to actually take you back to our router class, and within that router class we're going to locate this dispatch method right here. And remember what I was saying, the dispatch method creates our controller objects, and we creating our controller objects on this line right here, and that's exactly what we're going to do with this particular line right here, where we create our object. This constructor, we can pass in this argument, which is going to be this params, and this params is the property that we created within this class, this params right here. And remember what I was saying, this params contain all the parameters for the incoming URL, like the controller name, the action method, the namespace, token ID, whatever parameters that we've defined within our routing table. we're gonna actually store it within this params property and pass it to our controller objects constructor. Pass it in just like that, and that's how we're able to now get it within this constructor, which we're going to filter down to all of our sub controller classes. So in those sub controller classes within our application, we can actually fetch any parameters of that particular route. So again, we've modified our router file, and this is going to be pushed to GitHub, so you're going to get an updated file when we finish creating this particular section. So let's save that. And this is how we're going to jump back and forth at this point into what we've already done and tie it in. So you can see we've already tied in a little bit of this router class with our base controller class. So that's saved. Let's close that. Let's save this page. Right. And a next property that I want to create is a private property, and it's going to be an object. I'm going to call it twig, because twig is going to be our choice of template in engine. And I mean, we could have gone ahead and build our own, but that is outside the scope of this series, and there are far better options. Again, you can say there's better frameworks that we could use, but we're learning how to build frameworks, and we're learning the ins and out of putting one together. But when it comes to the templating side of it, I think we can just jump and use something that already existed. And Twig is one of my favorite templating engine, and it's what I've been using within this project for a long time. So we're going to go ahead and use that as well. But before we do anything else, let's actually start writing our base view, because this is where we're going to be instantiating our Twig component. So PHP declare strict types equal 1 namespace base view. Right, and at this point we're going to go ahead and install our first component through Composer. So I'm going to bring up my terminal. Okay, Composer require, let's go twig. Right, and that's gonna install Twig and place it within our composer.json file. So that's finished, and if we look in our JSON file, let's close that. You can see we've got our Twig that's been installed. All right, so let's close that out. And within our base view, I'm going to actually go ahead and start pulling in some of those Twig classes. So I'm going to say use, it's going to be Twig environment. So use Twig, and it's going to be the file system. Let's call loader. There's a couple more that I want to bring in. I'm going to bring them in right now. So I'm going to use Twig, and it's going to be extension, and it's going to be debug extension. And I think that's it. Yeah. So I'm going to come down here in my class body. I'm going to create a get template method. Let's be public function get template, and this contains 2 arguments, and the first is going to be a string, and that's going to be our template, which means our HTML template, right? And the second is going to be an array, and I'm going to call it context, and this is going to be the key value pair that we can pass to our template. Whatever like variable that or whatever we need to process within our template, we can pass it in the second argument, but I'm going to actually initialize it with an empty array, which means it's optional. We don't have to use it if we don't want to. We're using it if we've got data that we want to pass to our view template. So I'm going to create a static variable and call it twig. I'm going to say if twig equal null, let's go ahead and create our environment, right? I'm going to say loader equal new, and it's called file system loader, right? Then I'm going to create our twig environment and say twig equal new environment, right? And within that environment, I'm going to pass this loader variable that we've just created above, pass that file system in, and the second argument is an array, and this array is where we're going to pass in our twig configuration, and this is going to come from our application configuration directory, which we will be creating very shortly. So I'm going to set this as an empty array for now. And let's come back up to our file system loader, and let's actually delegate a directory that we're going to be storing all of our view files, and I'm going to call this directory templates. And we need to create a path. We need to like tell the file system where that directory is located, and I'm going to create I'm going to define a constant which is going to hold the path for these HTML templates within our project. And these are going to be view templates, and this is going to be part of the application, so it's going to be located within the application directory. So I'm going to make up a constant name. I'm going to call that templates path. We haven't created this constant yet, so it is something we're going to be creating very shortly. So what we want to do now is I want to call twig in lowercase twig, and want to add extension method, and within that method we're going to throw in this object, which is the debug extension, right? I'm going to add the next one, add extension, and we're going to throw in our new twig extension. And what this is doing, it allows us to extend twig functionality, which we're going to do because we're going to have a couple of functions that we're going to create as an extension to twig, so we can use it within our application. And I'm going to come outside here. I want to do return twig. It's going to be that twig render method, and pass in that template and that context variable, right? I know we can see a couple of errors right here for the time being. We will come back and address these, but this is the basic premise of what our template looks like. So yeah, get template context, file system loader, environment loader. Yep. All right, cool. And save that, and I'll come back to our base controller class, and we're going to pull this actual base view class in. So I'm going to say use magma base. I'm going to call in that base view. Then I'm going to pipe it to this twig property, new. And the reason why I'm doing it this way, I mean, we could have actually instantiate this base view class in all of our template files or all of our controller where we need to render a view, but I don't want to do it like that. I want to create a single method within my main controller class, which I can then use in all of my sub controller classes without creating new objects each time I need to render a view. So I've got that instantiation in one place, and I've got a method which I can then use to get my view or to pull my or send a response through a view template. And the method that we're going to create that's going to actually do this for us, I'm going to mimic that Twig method name render. I'm going to say public function render. And again, this takes in that to argument, and I'm going to type into it. It's going to be string, going to be template, or template. It's going to be array, context, and equal it to an empty array, which means it's optional. And all I'm going to say is if twig equal null, then I'm going to throw a logic exception. And because we're going to be creating base exception, I'm going to create a base logic exception and extend that PHP logic exception. So in our base directory, create a new directory, call that exception, create a new file, base logic exception.php. Let's just bootstrap that. Let's go PHP declare strict types equal 1 namespace magma base, and we're now within that exception directory. Let's go class base logic exception extends logic exception, just like that. I'm gonna leave it like that for now. Close this file. Let's just bring that in. Use magma base exception and bring that class in that we've just created. So we're going to say if twig is null, we're going to throw that new base logic exception. New base logic exception. And I'm going to pass a message, and it's going to say something like you cannot use the render method if the twig bundle is not available. Right, so you cannot use a render method if the twig bundle is not available. So essentially what we're saying is that if twig is not installed, then this method cannot be used. So this should be this twig, because we're referring to the property twig in this particular class, which is a object of this base view class. And at this point, we're going to just actually return that method, that get template method. It's going to be this twig get template. I'm just going to pass in these two arguments, template and context, right? And that's pretty much all it is to actually getting a view template within our controller. Just going to call this method, pass in our template path and whatever context we want within that template. Again, we're going to jig this about later on when we install Symfony HTTP Foundation component, and we're going to wrap this in their response class. So again, this is the basic of what we're doing right now, and this will work without the Symfony response. This will just work. Let's save that, and let's jump to our base model class. It's going to be PHP declare strict types namespace magma base. That's it. The class base model, and this base model class is going to contain some properties that we're going to require in order for our entity or database to know which table to interact with. So whatever model that we've got in our application has to sort of like extend this base model, and then they have to sort of like supply the required information that the actual ORM will require in order to fetch the correct details. So I'm going to create some actual private properties. our protected properties. Actually, make it private so we can't change them anywhere. So it's going to be private, and it's going to be table schema. Remember, this was a string, so I'm going to type into string. The private string, the table schema ID, right? And the last property I'm going to create is also private. And say private, and this is going to be a object for now. I might change that in a bit. It'll be an object, and it's going to be our repository. So let's create our constructor class. It'll be public function construct, and this constructor is going to contain a couple of arguments, which is going to be string, be your table schema, and string, be your table schema ID, and they're not initialized because these are required arguments. And I'm going to go one step further and say if empty table schema or, and note these two pipe characters stands for or. I could have also done that, or it would be the same, but I prefer to go with the pipe characters. And say or empty table schema ID, I want to throw an exception. So I'm going to throw new base invalid argument exception. I'm going to say these arguments are required. I will modify this to something a little bit better later on, the message, but we're going to keep it a little bit generic for now. And that's basically what we're saying. These two arguments, in order to get the correct information, we need to specify the table name that we're trying to fetch data from, and the table schema ID is not so important, but we're going to define it because, as you were seeing in our CRUD class that we created, we rely on that table schema ID to actually fetch or save data. So at this point, we're going to actually create an object of our data repository factory, which is something that we did in our ORM down here. So we got our data repository and we got the factory. Now the factory hooks up everything else, but how do we get that factory to actually do what we want it to do? And that's what we're going to do now. So I'm going to leave it open for now. Come back to this class. I'm going to say factory equal new data repository factory, and let's bring that class in. Oh, well, it's done it already. It's brought it in for us already, right? So this actual class, if we look at it again, this is a constructor, and it's got 3 arguments in. It's got a CRUD identifier, which is not that relevant. I'm just going to name it. So if we're using different instances of this framework, we know what is doing what, if that makes sense. So that's not that important, but the 2 important argument is this table schema and the table schema ID, which is what it's asking for within this constructor. So the first argument, I'm going to say an empty string for now. Then the second argument is going to be the table schema, and the third argument is that table schema ID, right? And that's how we're hooking up our application models to our repository, because once we extend this base model in our application, when we come in to do our database interaction, as I'm saying, we need to get that table name and that table and that unique ID for that particular table. So we've created an object of our data repository factory. Now we need to call this create method and pass in our data repository string, which we're going to do now. I'm going to create, well, we've done it right here. So I'm going to say this repository equal factory, I'm going to call that create method. Then we need to pass in that repository that we're going to need, that we're going to use, and it is this class right here, right? So we need to pass that into our model so we can get access to all of these methods down here within our application. So there's two ways we can do it, and they both give you the same result. I can say data repository class, but then I have to bring it in. Well, there you go, it's done it already, it's right here, and that will work. Or we could have done the namespace version, which we could just take all of that in, copy that, and paste it like that, put a backtick right here, and that will work the same. It's the same thing. So let's go back with this option because it's a bit more neater. So now we've sort of like created our base model where we're bringing in our data repository. We need to actually define a way of how we're going to actually get access to those repository method within our model, which ultimately we're going to be using within our controller classes. So I'm going to create a new method called public function get repo, short for get repository, obviously. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to return this property, which is this repository property, and that's it. And this, through this method, will give us access to all of these methods within this repository class, right? So let's close that. Let's close our factory, and this is our base, or three base classes, which we're now starting off with within our base directory. And this is the core part of our MVC application, because we've got these base classes which we're going to extend from, which is going to give us the ability to get data from our, when it comes to our model, get data from our ORM. When it comes to our view, we're using Twig templating engine, and when it comes to our controller classes, we've now got access to all the routing parameters, which is what we've passed in as an argument within the constructor, and that's actually linked dispatch method within our router class. Oh, you're seeing how we're starting to link these up. Now there's much more base classes within this within this framework which we've not touched on yet, and we're going to be touching on them in a video coming up very shortly. And that's it for this little segment. Remember to like, share and subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned for the next set of videos.